29, 1945, Bavaria, Germany. In the final weeks of the war, soldiers of the U.S. Third Army under General George S. Patton were pushing steadily through southern Germany. They had been fighting almost without pause for more than 500 days. Their path had carried them across North Africa, through Sicily and France, and now deep into the German heartland. Along the way, they had witnessed the destruction wrought by modern warfare. Cities shattered into ruins, battlefields strewn with corpses, the relentless brutality of mechanized combat. They believed there was nothing left that war could show them. They were profoundly, catastrophically mistaken. On April 29th, advanced elements of the 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbird Division, and the 42nd Infantry Division, known as the Rainbow Division, moved toward a facility roughly 16 kilometers northwest of Munich. Allied intelligence had identified the site as Dachau, a concentration camp, though little was known about its exact conditions. The soldiers expected something akin to a prisoner of war camp. They anticipated harsh treatment, perhaps visible signs of abuse. No one imagined the Nazis had treated prisoners humanely. Yet no briefing, no report, no rumor prepared them for what they were about to encounter. Before reaching the main gates of the camp, the soldiers came upon a train. 39 freight cars stood motionless on a stretch of track near the facility. The cars were sealed, but the odor emanating from them was overwhelming, an unmistakable stench of death and decay. When soldiers slid open the door of the first car, the sight before them would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The car was packed with human bodies, piled atop one another in grotesque disarray. Men, women, and some who appeared to be children. The corpses were in varying stages of decomposition, some recently dead, others dead for days. Many were skeletal, starved to the point that bones pressed sharply against skin. Some still wore the striped uniforms of concentration camp prisoners. Others were naked or clothed only in rags. Several bore gunshot wounds, evidence that prisoners had been killed during transport or while attempting to escape. The soldiers opened more cars. Each revealed the same horror, bodies stacked like cordwood. The train, which would later be known as the Death Train, contained approximately 2,000 corpses. It had departed from Buchenwald concentration camp days earlier, evacuating prisoners as Allied forces closed in. The prisoners had been crammed into sealed freight cars without food, water, or ventilation. Many died of starvation, dehydration, or exposure during the journey. Others were shot by SS guards for crying out or attempting escape when the train stopped. When the train reached Dachau, the guards simply abandoned it, fleeing as American forces approached and leaving the dead inside. The reaction of the American soldiers was immediate and visceral. These were hardened combat veterans, men who had survived some of the bloodiest fighting of a European theater. Yet the death train broke them. Some vomited. Others wept openly. A few stood frozen, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. Private James Hoy of Ohio, who had fought from Normandy into Germany, later wrote that the death train was worse than anything he had experienced in battle. Combat killed soldiers, young men who had chosen to fight. The death train revealed the systematic murder of innocents. People starved and killed for no reason other than ideology and hatred. April 29, 1945. Afternoon. Dachau concentration camp. What followed the liberation of Dachau would be classified as secret and remain partially obscured for decades. The full extent of what occurred was never completely documented. Yet through witness testimony, official reports, and survivor accounts, a fragmented picture eventually emerged of what happened when American soldiers and liberated prisoners confronted SS guards. The exact number of SS personnel killed during the liberation remains uncertain. Official estimates range between 35 and 50. Some were killed by American soldiers. Others were killed by former prisoners. In many cases, it was impossible to determine who fired the fatal shots. What is known is that a number of SS guards who attempted to surrender were executed rather than taken prisoner, actions that violated military law and the Geneva Convention. One of the first documented incidents involved Lieutenant William Walsh. Walsh had been among the officers who inspected the death train, walking its length and opening car after car, confronting the stacked corpses within. He then entered the camp itself and saw the surviving prisoners, skeletal figures barely clinging to life. When 4 SS officers emerged from nearby woods carrying a white flag, the universal symbol of surrender, Walsh encountered them. They were attempting to give themselves up, likely expecting to be treated as prisoners of war and protected under international law. Walsh stood before 4 SS officers in clean uniforms, well-fed and healthy, surrendering after presiding over a place where thousands had been systematically murdered. Something inside Walsh broke. He ordered his men to march the 4 SS officers back toward the death train. There, he forced them to climb into one of the freight cars, one still packed with the corpses of prisoners who had died under SS custody. Walsh made the officers stand among the bodies, surrounded by the physical evidence of what the camp system had produced. Then he drew his pistol and shot all 4 men. They collapsed among the corpses, mortally wounded but not yet dead. Their screams drew other American soldiers to the scene. Several of them finished what Walsh had begun, executing the wounded SS officers. The killings at the death train were only the beginning. As additional American units entered the camp and encountered SS guards attempting to surrender, similar incidents unfolded across the facility. At the coal yard near the edge of the camp, 16 SS guards who had been detained were lined up against a wall. An improvised firing squad of American soldiers formed, and the guards were executed, without trial, without processing, and without any of the procedures required by military law or international convention. At Tower B, one of the guard posts overlooking the camp, 17 more SS guards were shot. Some were trying to surrender, others attempting to hide. All were killed. These executions were not accidental or the result of momentary confusion. They were deliberate acts carried out by American soldiers who had decided that the SS guards deserved immediate death rather than protections of military justice. But the actions of American soldiers were only part of what occurred. The liberated prisoners, men who had endured years of starvation, torture, and humiliation, suddenly found themselves empowered. The guards who had terrorized them were now defenseless, and many prisoners sought revenge. Winnie Lenarch, a Polish prisoner who had survived years in Dachau, later described the chaos that followed liberation. Prisoners seized SS guards and attacked them. Guards were knocked to the ground, and, as Lenarch recalled, no one could tell whether they were trampled or beaten, but they were killed. He explained the prisoners' mindset simply. For years, they had been treated like animals. Liberation was their birthday, the day they could finally strike back. The violence was direct and savage. Prisoners beat SS guards with fists, with stones, with anything they could find. Guards who had inflicted years of suffering were killed within minutes by their former victims. American soldiers witnessed this violence and were confronted with a choice. Military law required them to intervene and protect surrendering enemies in order to maintain order. Many chose not to. They turned away. They allowed the prisoners to take revenge. In at least one documented case, American soldiers stood by while 2 liberated prisoners beat an SS guard to death with a shovel. The soldiers could have stopped it easily. They did not. They watched as a guard who had tormented prisoners for years was killed by the men he had brutalized. Another American soldier later recalled seeing a prisoner stomping on the face of an SS guard until, in his words, there was not much left. When the soldier confronted the prisoner afterward and remarked that he carried a great deal of hatred in his heart, the prisoner simply nodded. He offered no apology, no explanation. None was needed, not after what had occurred in that place. The violence extended beyond the camp itself. As American forces secured the surrounding area, they discovered SS guards who had fled and were hiding in nearby buildings. Some had discarded their uniforms and disguised themselves as civilians or displaced persons, but the prisoners recognized them. They knew the faces of their tormentors and pointed them out to American soldiers or hunted them down themselves. An American chaplain, a man trained in mercy and forgiveness, was approached by 3 young Jewish prisoners. They told him they had found one of the camp's most sadistic guards hiding in a barn, dressed as a peasant. They had beaten him to death. The chaplain did not condemn them. He did not speak of sin, the sanctity of life, or turning the other cheek. He simply nodded and walked away. Even a man of God, confronted with what occurred at Dachau, understood that conventional moral frameworks no longer applied. Some of the violence involved direct complicity by American soldiers. Weapons taken from captured or killed SS guards were handed to prisoners. Soldiers then looked away as those weapons were used to execute guards. This was a clear violation of military law. Arming prisoners and permitting the killing of surrendering enemies was forbidden under all military regulations and international conventions. But the soldiers who did so no longer cared about regulations. They had seen the death train. They had walked through the camp. They had decided that the SS guards deserved whatever fate the prisoners imposed. The collapse of discipline at Dachau was not absolute. Many American soldiers maintained control and followed proper procedures. Numerous SS guards were taken into custody unharmed and processed as prisoners of war. Yet in the first hours after liberation, there were repeated violations of military law. Surrendering enemies executed, prisoners armed and allowed to kill, and soldiers standing by while violence they were obligated to prevent unfolded before them. The soldiers involved made no effort to conceal what had happened. They did not claim that the SS guards had been killed in combat or while attempting to escape. They openly acknowledged that surrendering prisoners had been executed, that military law had been violated, and that, by the strict legal definition, American forces had committed war crimes. They simply did not care. They had seen Dachau. They had witnessed evidence of systematic murder on a scale that defied comprehension, and they believed that the SS guards who had operated the camp deserved death regardless of what military law required. By the evening of April 29th, order had largely been restored. Officers reasserted control. The execution stopped. Remaining SS personnel were taken into custody and processed through proper channels. Medical teams began treating liberated prisoners. Army engineers organized the immense logistical effort required to care for nearly 30,000 survivors. But what had occurred in those first hours could not be undone. Between 35 and 50 SS guards had been killed after attempting to surrender, some by American soldiers, some by liberated prisoners, and some in circumstances where responsibility could not be clearly determined. The evidence was extensive. Numerous soldiers had witnessed the killings. Officers had submitted reports. The incidents could neither be hidden nor ignored. Within days, account of the reprisals at Dachau reached higher command, placing the U.S. Army in a profound dilemma. American soldiers had violated military law and international conventions. Should they be prosecuted? Should there be consequences for breaking the rules of war? Even when those violations occurred in response to confronting the most horrific atrocity of the conflict, the decision would ultimately fall to General George S. Patton, recently appointed military governor of Bavaria. Patton's view of what had happened at Dachau was shaped by his own experience with the concentration camp system. May 1945. 7th Army Headquarters, Bavaria. Reports from Dachau reached Patton's desk within days of the camp's liberation. They detail what American soldiers had found. The death train, skeletal survivors, piles of corpses, unmistakable evidence of systematic murder. They also describe how American troops had responded. The execution of surrendering SS guards and acts of violence carried out by liberated prisoners while soldiers stood aside. Patton read the reports carefully. He was no stranger to the camps. Weeks earlier, on April 12th, he had personally visited Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald. Ohrdruf had been the first concentration camp liberated by American forces, and Patton had insisted on seeing it himself. The visit affected him deeply. He was a hard man, a career soldier hardened by decades of service and brutal campaigns, a commander who prided himself on his ability to face any horror without flinching. Yet after touring Ohrdruf, after seeing the bodies, the instruments of torture, the crematorium ovens, Patton walked behind a building and vomited. His aide witnessed a moment and recorded in his diary that he had never seen Patton so physically shaken. Patton's reaction was not weakness. It was a response of man confronting evil on a scale he had not believed possible, and it profoundly shaped his views on how those responsible for such crimes should be treated. Now, as military governor of Bavaria, Patton was responsible for deciding how to handle the reports from Dachau. A formal investigation had already been ordered. Testimony was being gathered, incidents documented, and pressure mounted from some quarters to pursue courts-martial against soldiers who had executed surrendering prisoners. From a legal standpoint, the case was clear. Military law and the Geneva Convention explicitly prohibited the execution of prisoners who had surrendered. The SS guards at Dachau, however monstrous their crimes, had been attempting to surrender when they were killed. Under international law, they should have been taken into custody and processed for war crimes trials. The soldiers who killed them, particularly Lieutenant William Walsh, who had shot 4 SS officers inside a freight car, had violated those laws. Their actions met the legal definition of war crimes. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whitaker, Assistant Inspector General of the 7th Army, was assigned to conduct a formal investigation. He interviewed dozens of soldiers who had been present at Dachau, collected eyewitness testimony, and documented the violations of military law that had occurred. Based on Whitaker's findings, charges were prepared. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks, commander of the battalion that first entered the camp, faced charges related to failure to maintain discipline and prevent war crimes. Lieutenant William Walsh faced potential murder charges. Other soldiers were cited for their involvement in the executions. The charges were serious and well documented. If pursued, they would result in courts-martial and potentially severe punishments for soldiers who had violated military law. But the prosecutions required approval to proceed, and that approval rested with General Patton. Patton weighed the situation carefully. He understood the legal arguments. He recognized that military discipline depended on accountability and consequences for violations of the law. Patton understood the danger of his choice. He knew that failing to prosecute could establish a troubling precedent, that soldiers might believe they were free to execute prisoners whenever they felt the enemy deserved it. But he also understood what his men had encountered at Dachau. He had seen similar horrors at Ohrdruf. He knew that the SS guards at Dachau had operated a facility where tens of thousands of people had been systematically murdered, that they had shown no mercy, and that they had overseen years of torture, starvation, and industrial-scale killing. When American soldiers, men who had fought honorably for years, who had obeyed the laws of war and maintained discipline through relentless combat, were suddenly confronted with those guards and the physical evidence of their crimes, they responded with rage and violence. Patton weighed this reality and made his decision. He ordered all charges dismissed. No courts-martial would proceed. No disciplinary action would be taken against any soldier involved in the Dachau executions. The decision was deeply controversial. Critics argued that it undermined military discipline, set a dangerous precedent, and suggested that the laws of war could be ignored whenever soldiers felt morally justified. Others warned that it weakened America's moral authority in prosecuting Nazi war criminals. Patton's reasoning, however, was direct. His soldiers had confronted the worst atrocity of the war. They had seen acts that shattered every assumption about human civilization. They had responded as human beings, not as perfectly disciplined automatons. Patton would not punish men for being human in the face of inhuman evil. The matter was not entirely closed. Despite Patton's decision, the Judge Advocate General's office conducted an independent legal review to establish precedent and clarify how similar situations should be handled in the future. Colonel Charles L. Decker, acting Deputy Judge Advocate, was assigned to provide the final legal opinion. Completed in late 1945, Decker's analysis was unusually candid and would become one of the most significant legal documents addressing the Dachau reprisals. Decker began by acknowledging the obvious. Violations of international law had occurred. He wrote explicitly that there appeared to have been a violation of the letter of international law, as SS guards had been shot without trial. This was not cautious or ambiguous language. Decker stated plainly that American forces had committed acts that met the legal definition of war crimes. The execution of surrendering prisoners violated the Geneva Convention. The soldiers involved had broken the laws of war. But Decker then turned to the circumstances surrounding those violations. He described what confronted the first combat troops to enter Dachau. The death train holding roughly 2,000 corpses, 30,000 skeletal prisoners barely clinging to life, bodies scattered throughout the camp, and overwhelming evidence of systematic torture and murder. Given these conditions, Decker concluded that justice and equity do not require that the difficult and perhaps impossible task of fixing individual responsibility be undertaken. This sentence captured the core dilemma. Yes, crimes have been committed by American soldiers, but those acts occurred in response to crimes of vastly greater magnitude, atrocities so extreme that holding individual soldiers legally accountable appeared unjust. Decker also noted the practical impossibility of precise accountability. Multiple soldiers had fired on the same targets. Liberated prisoners had participated in the killings. The chaos of Liberation Day made exact reconstruction nearly impossible. More importantly, Decker's analysis emphasized context. Soldiers confronted with the reality of the Holocaust, he argued, could not be judged by the same standards as those operating under normal combat conditions. The extreme circumstances created mitigating factors that outweighed the technical violations of law. The legal conclusion was clear. The case was closed. No charges would be filed. No courts-martial would proceed. No punishments would be imposed on any soldier involved in the Dachau reprisals. The decision reflected both pragmatic and moral considerations. Prosecuting the liberators of a death camp would have been politically disastrous. The American public would not have understood or accepted it. But beyond pragmatism lay genuine moral uncertainty. Whether soldiers who had witnessed Dachau could be fairly judged by those who had not, whether perfect discipline could reasonably be expected in the face of such horror, and whether some circumstances existed beyond the frameworks military law was designed to govern. The soldiers involved were never officially sanctioned, but they lived what they had done, and their responses varied. Lieutenant William Walsh, who had executed 4 SS officers inside a freight car, never expressed remorse. When interviewed decades later, in 1990, he was asked directly about the killings. His answer was blunt and unapologetic. He said he did not believe there was any SS guard killed at Dachau who wondered why it happened or could not understand the reason. The implication was unmistakable. The guards knew exactly why they were being executed. They knew what they had done at Dachau. And when American soldiers, fresh from discovering a train filled with corpses, decided those guards deserved immediate death, the guards understood the connection. Walsh's position represented one end of the spectrum. Complete certainty that his actions had been justified, that the SS guards deserved execution, and that no apology was required or appropriate. Other soldiers who participated in or witnessed the reprisals experienced far more complicated emotions. Some believed the actions had been unavoidable in the moment, yet wished they had never been necessary. Others struggled with the knowledge that they had violated principles they had been raised to respect. Some refused to speak about what had happened at all, finding it too painful or too complex to explain to those who had not been there. Despite the wide range of reactions, one belief remained constant. The soldiers felt that anyone who had not seen Dachau could not fully judge their actions. That understanding what they had done required understanding what they had seen. That moral judgment of the Dachau reprisals was impossible without confronting the context that had produced them. Officially, the case was closed, but intellectually and morally, it remained open. Historians, legal scholars, and military ethicists would debate the events for decades, grappling with questions that resisted easy answers. What is the appropriate response when soldiers encounter atrocities so extreme that ordinary moral frameworks collapse? Can military law function effectively when applied to circumstances far beyond those it was designed to govern? And where is the boundary between justice and vengeance when the crimes being answered are crimes against humanity itself? There were no simple resolutions. The Dachau reprisals would endure as a reminder that some questions cannot be conclusively resolved, only examined in their full and troubling complexity. April 30th, 1945, 10 Downing Street, London. News of what had occurred at Dachau reached London within days. Reports flowed through military and intelligence channels, describing both the horrors uncovered at the camp and the violent reprisals that followed. Prime Minister Winston Churchill received detailed briefings outlining the liberation, the death train, the condition of the prisoners, and the execution of SS guards by American soldiers and liberated inmates. Churchill had known of Nazi atrocities for years. Throughout the war, intelligence reports had described the systematic murder of Jews and other groups targeted by the Nazi regime. He had spoken publicly about these crimes, though the full scale of the Holocaust had not yet been fully documented or widely understood. Months earlier, Churchill had articulated his view of Nazi criminality in stark terms. He had described it as likely the greatest and most horrible crime ever committed in the history of the world, carried out by scientific machinery, by men nominally civilized, in the name of a powerful state and one of the principal races of Europe. His words acknowledged something unprecedented. Not merely mass murder, but systematic, bureaucratic, industrialized extermination. This was not ordinary warfare, nor even ordinary atrocity. It was something fundamentally different. Now, confronted with detailed reports from Dachau, Churchill faced difficult questions. American soldiers had violated international law and military regulations by executing surrendering SS guards. Should Britain, as an ally, condemn those actions? Should Churchill publicly emphasize adherence to the Geneva Convention? His response was deliberate and revealing. Churchill did not condemn the American soldiers. He did not issue statements stressing discipline or legal compliance. He did not frame the reprisals as a failure of American military justice. Instead, he focused on evidence. He wanted the world to see what the Nazis had done. He wanted proof so overwhelming that denial would be impossible. He wanted the crimes documented so thoroughly that future generations could never dismiss the Holocaust as exaggeration or wartime propaganda. Churchill made a decision. A British parliamentary delegation would be sent to Germany to witness the concentration camps firsthand. Elected representatives of the British people would see the evidence themselves and report back to the nation. The delegation would not visit Dachau, which lay in the American zone. Instead, they would go to Buchenwald, liberated by American forces on April 11th and now accessible to Allied observers. Churchill's instructions were unequivocal. They would see everything, document everything, and tell the truth, fully and without restraint, about what the Nazi regime had done. On April 19th, a delegation of 10 British parliamentarians departed for Germany. The group included 8 members of the House of Commons and 2 members of the House of Lords, drawn from different political parties and constituencies to ensure their findings could not be dismissed as partisan or propagandistic. They arrived at Buchenwald on April 21st, 1945, 10 days after its liberation. By then, the camp had been partially cleared. The most critically ill prisoners had been evacuated for medical care, and some bodies had been buried. Yet enough remained to provide irrefutable evidence of what had occurred. Nothing could have prepared the British parliamentarians for what they were about to witness. The men who entered Buchenwald were educated and experienced. Lawyers, businessmen, senior political figures accustomed to grappling with complex and difficult problems. Yet nothing in their background prepared them for what they encountered. Buchenwald strained their capacity to comprehend reality itself. They were shown the survivors, men reduced to living skeletons, many too weak to stand. They saw the barracks where prisoners had been crammed together in conditions that would have been considered inhumane even for animals. They were taken to the crematorium ovens, some still containing charred human remains. They saw the medical experimentation facilities, where prisoners had been subjected to torturous procedures in the name of pseudoscience. They were shown piles of bodies awaiting cremation, undeniable evidence of the scale of death at Buchenwald. They walked past whipping posts, punishment cells, execution sites, the machinery of routine cruelty. Survivors testified about daily life in the camp: starvation, brutality, arbitrary killings, and systematic dehumanization. The British parliamentarians moved through the camp in stunned silence. Several became physically ill. Others wept openly. All were profoundly shaken. One member later wrote that he had previously believed reports of Nazi concentration camps were exaggerated, that wartime propaganda must have inflated enemy crimes. Walking through Buchenwald destroyed that skepticism completely. The reality was worse than anything propaganda had described. The delegation spent hours in camp, determined to see everything. They interviewed survivors, examined physical evidence, took notes, and asked detailed questions. They understood that they were not simply witnessing history. They were gathering testimony that would need to withstand scrutiny for generations. They were determined to understand precisely what they were seeing, so they could explain it truthfully and accurately to those who had not been there. The delegation returned to London and immediately prepared a report for Prime Minister Churchill. It was submitted on April 25th, just 4 days after their visit, a speed that reflected the urgency they felt to document what they had seen. The report was detailed and unsparing. It described conditions at Buchenwald in explicit terms, included survivor testimony, and documented systematic murder, medical experimentation, torture, and deliberate starvation. It left no doubt that Buchenwald had been designed for the systematic destruction of human beings. Churchill read the report carefully upon receiving it and arranged to present its findings to Parliament on April 27, 1945. His presentation was solemn and restrained. He did not embellish or dramatize the delegation's conclusions. He simply presented what British parliamentarians, men known and trusted by their colleagues, had witnessed with their own eyes, and what that evidence revealed about the nature of the Nazi regime. The impact on Parliament was profound. Members who had been skeptical of earlier reports were forced to confront testimony from their own peers. This was not enemy propaganda. It was first-hand observation. It could not be dismissed or minimized. Churchill's purpose in sending the delegation and presenting its findings was strategic. He understood that documentation was essential. He anticipated that future generations would need overwhelming evidence of the Holocaust, that denial and minimization would inevitably arise, and that the truth would have to be defended with irrefutable testimony. That focus on documentation also explains what Churchill chose not to address. In his presentation to Parliament, he made no mention of the Dachau reprisals. He did not discuss violations of the Geneva Convention or concerns about Allied military discipline. The omission was deliberate. Churchill had decided that the priority was exposing Nazi crimes, not condemning Allied soldiers who had reacted violently to discovering them. His position regarding the SS guards was not new. Months earlier, in July 1944, Churchill had written to the Foreign Secretary that all those involved in Nazi crimes who fell into Allied hands, including those who claimed they were merely following orders, should be condemned to death. The statement was unequivocal. Churchill believed that everyone involved in operating the concentration camp system, from commanders to guards, deserved execution. By that standard, the American soldiers at Dachau had acted in accordance with his view. They had not relied on courts or legal procedures, but they had executed men who had operated a death camp. And Churchill, having already declared that such individuals should be condemned to death, was not inclined to criticize soldiers for carrying out that sentence immediately rather than waiting for formal trials. His position reflected a pragmatic understanding of moral complexity. Yes, military law had been violated. Yes, executing surrendering prisoners was forbidden under international convention. But those prisoners had been SS guards at Dachau, men who had participated in systematic murder for years. Churchill grasped something that more rigid moral frameworks often fail to accommodate, that in extraordinary circumstances, strict legal correctness may matter less than substantive justice. The SS guards at Dachau would almost certainly have been tried and executed through legal channels. The American soldiers had simply accelerated that outcome. Churchill's decision not to condemn the Dachau reprisals was also politically astute. Britain and the United States were allies. The war was not yet fully concluded, and fighting continued in the Pacific, creating diplomatic friction over violations that occurred in response to the discovery of the Holocaust would serve no constructive purpose. Churchill chose instead to focus on what mattered most, ensuring that the world understood, beyond any possibility of denial, what the Nazi regime had done. The objective was clear: to document Nazi crimes so completely that they could never be denied or minimized, to ensure the world understood what had been done, and create a historical record that would endure for generations. In this, Churchill's approach succeeded. The report produced by the British parliamentary delegation became part of the vast body of Holocaust documentation. Combined with American military records, Soviet evidence, and survivor testimony, the accumulated proof was overwhelming and irrefutable. In the months and years that followed, as the full scope of the Holocaust became undeniable, Churchill's decision prioritized documentation over condemnation of Allied soldiers who had reacted violently to the camps was increasingly seen as justified. The world needed to see and understand Nazi atrocities. That imperative outweighed the need for perfect adherence to military regulations in the immediate aftermath of liberation. Decades later, when historians revisited Churchill's response to the Dachau reprisals, most concluded that he had made the correct choice. He had recognized that some situations fall outside ordinary moral and legal frameworks, that soldiers confronted with direct evidence of the Holocaust could not be judged by conventional standards, and that the central priority was ensuring the truth of Nazi crimes was preserved, not punishing Allied soldiers for reacting with rage to what they had discovered. Lieutenant William Walsh, who had executed 4SS officers at Dachau, never expressed remorse. When interviewed in 1990, 45 years after the events, he stated plainly that he did not believe any SS guard killed there had wondered why he was being executed or failed to understand the reason. Churchill, had he been asked, might well have agreed. The SS guards at Dachau knew what they had done. They knew what they had participated in. And when American soldiers, having just discovered 2,000 corpses packed into freight cars, decided those guards deserved immediate death, the connection was unmistakable. Churchill's enduring contribution was recognizing that in the face of unprecedented evil, normal rules and procedures might not fully apply. That sometimes the most important responsibility of leadership is not enforcing flawless discipline, but ensuring that truth is recorded so thoroughly that it can never be erased or denied. The Dachau reprisals violated military law, but Churchill understood they represented something more complex than simple criminality. They were the response of human beings confronted with evidence of systematic evil on a scale they had never imagined possible. Churchill, who had spent 5 years fighting Nazi Germany, who had led Britain through its darkest hours, who had witnessed the full extent of Nazi brutality, understood that justice and vengeance are not always opposites. Sometimes they are different names for the same necessary response to absolute evil. The old lion who had fought the Nazis since 1939 grasped something that more conventional leaders might not, that the line between justice and vengeance is not always clear, that sometimes it is not a line at all, but an abyss, and that the soldiers who looked into that abyss at Dachau, who saw what the Nazi system had created, reacted in the only way human beings sometimes can when confronted with the unthinkable. Churchill did not condemn them. He documented what they had found. He ensured the world would know. And he left judgment of their actions to history. And to those who understand that sometimes there are no good choices, only terrible necessities. Perhaps, in the end, Lieutenant Walsh and Winston Churchill would have agreed completely. The SS guards at Dachau knew exactly why they died, and that knowledge in itself was all the trial they believed was required.